Do you hear that? That is conscious, destimulating silence. It is withdrawal from the system. This article came through the feed and it almost escaped my attention because that's how the internet works. But I read a little bit of it and I started thinking, there's actually something important here. This actually is worth paying attention to. And that's when I showed it to Melissa.
Hey, guys.
So this came out on the BBC. There were similar articles in the New York Times and several other papers, actually. It's been kind of going around. And the headline is dopamine fasting Silicon Valley's new productivity fad? And they've had lots of fads. They've been in the news for microdosing, LSD and stuff at work. They're all into yoga and going to exotic places and having special retreats and I don't know what else. I don't really follow it.
Getting injected with the blood of young people.
Yeah,
you know, things
all
like
that stuff.
Just
Being
whatever.
technically vampires and that kind of thing. I was reading this and you know, they got this 24-year-old entrepreneur / executive technology guy. His name is James Sinka, and he's now promoting dopamine fasting and apparently taking it very seriously in his own life because even at age 24, he's facing burnout from too much technology, from all the long hours of coding and programming and doing the business side of things that they do in Silicon Valley and the venture capitalist circles and whatnot. And, you know, he's connected to Y Combinator. That's a firm that's come up at Bilderberg year after year. And they basically incubate and finance new firms that are trying to grow and take off. And this guy, James Sinka, just happens to be tied to MageMarket.com. And it's the first one they promote when you look up Y Combinator. And he's pretty much one of the leading companies from the W19 batch. At least on the surface, it's a marketplace for Magic the Gathering cards. I'm not really sure why that's important compared with firms that are producing new biotechnology agriculture and growing smart cities and interacting with technology for transportation and stuff that's coming, stuff they're funding and working on. Anyway, the point is this guy is making a special determination to take time off from multi-million-dollar firms, you know, days that might be worth tens of thousands, I don't know, to go on vacation for a couple days, not to go do things that are fun, but to specifically try to do things that aren't fun. When James Sinka starts his dopamine fast, he cuts himself off from as many external stimuli as possible. He'll stop eating, instead only drinking water to stay hydrated. He'll ignore his phone, laptop, and other tech devices. He'll try and avoid interacting with people as much as possible, including making eye contact. He sends messages to his friends and family ahead of time and tells them, "I'm booking 17 November for a dopamine fast. I'm sorry you won't hear from me. It's not that I don't love you, but it's a thing I have to do for myself." And that's how it begins for his little ritual of cutting himself off from the world and taking a dopamine fast where he tries not to eat or engage in technology or really do anything to regulate his own metabolism, his own brain chemistry that is otherwise so saturated in technology that it's facing a sort of crisis. And this is a crisis that everyone is facing because we're so immersed in this technology. It's so much a part of our lives that some people can't put the phones down at all. Other people spend 8 hours or more on a computer per day. Everyone in general, statistically on average, is spending dozens and dozens and dozens of hours a week on this stuff. And this James Sinka guy, as well as other people in the Silicon Valley circles, he told the New York Times, quote, "We're addicted to dopamine." You know, that's the level that it's at. We're addicted to dopamine, and therefore he's talking about dopamine fasting. This article descends into various experts and life coaches and psychologists who kind of poke fun at it and say, you know, it's not a bad idea. There's definitely something to it, but isn't it just called taking a break? Isn't it just called meditation? Isn't it just called turning off the device? Well, no, I think there's actually a very particular reason why they're using the word dopamine fasting. It's a brain metabolism issue.
And we talked about this last year. We did a video about social media programming everyone. And this is after you had two high-level Facebook people, including Sean Parker, who co-created it, come out and tell everyone that the way social media works is to keep people hooked with short-term, dopamine-driven social validation feedback loops.
Building these applications was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And that means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. And that's going to get you to contribute more content, and that's going to get you more likes and comments. I mean, it's a social validation feedback loop.
And the other guy, who was a former vice president of user growth at Facebook for many years, actually said the short-term dopamine-driven feedback loops that we have created are destroying how society works. That's a pretty strong line of talk.
The short-term dopamine-driven feedback loops that we have created are destroying how society works. No civil discourse, no cooperation, misinformation, mistruth. It's a really, really bad state of affairs. And we compound the problem, right? We curate our lives around this perceived sense of perfection.
But it's because they're hacking people's brains and programming them to get hooked into this technology and stay on it for as long as possible via this release of short-term dopamine-driven feedback loops. It just keeps you on like an addict.
We call it in the trade the dopamine hit. That's what it's called in Facebook, for instance. The founders of the great Silicon Valley spying empires like Facebook have publicly declared that they intentionally included addictive schemes in their designs.
The inventors understood this consciously, and we did it anyway. When it grows to 1 billion or 2 billion people, it literally changes your relationship with society. God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains.
Consumer internet businesses are about exploiting psychology. We want to psychologically figure out how to manipulate you as fast as possible and then give you back that dopamine hit. We did that brilliantly at Facebook. Instagram has done it. WhatsApp has done it. Exploiting psychology of mass populations of people.
So let's talk about this for just a second. Dopamine's a neurotransmitter. It's one of a series of chemicals in your brain that mediates the transmission of electrical signals between your neurons. And different neurotransmitters do different things, but dopamine is specifically the brain's pleasure drug. Its highest concentrations are associated with the areas of the central nervous system believed to be responsible for your feelings and emotions of pleasure and extreme happiness. So it's associated with reward and motivation. It's the brain's reward system. It works on dopamine. And so you could really easily see how this would fit into addiction with something like alcohol or nicotine or crack or chocolate donuts or Netflix binges or insert substance or activity here, whatever it is.
This is what I would call almost a stealthy addiction. We'll get them hooked through a scheme of rewards and punishment. And the rewards are when you're retweeted. The punishment is when you're treated badly by others online. And then within that, we'll very gradually start to leverage that to change them. So it's this very kind of stealthy manipulation of the population.
If something is stimulating high levels of dopamine to be produced, and the person continues doing that thing constantly, the levels of dopamine in their brain will remain abnormally high. And initially that's going to feel really good, but eventually the person's going to become desensitized to that level of dopamine and have to do it more and more and more to get the same pleasure and rewards. And it basically hooks the person like an addiction, and they get burned out because they just keep trying to get that high that they initially got from the reward system, and they have to just keep doing it more and more and more.
It's a vice thing. It's something humans have been dealing with for millennia, for thousands of years. It's nothing new, except that a lot of those behaviors, drugs and eating and sexual promiscuity, you don't normally do it in front of crowds of people for their applause, awaiting their approval. And it's normally tied, at least to some degree, with the taboo. I mean, we recognize people that have these problems, and it generally doesn't affect everyone. But now all of a sudden we have a technology that everyone is using. Kids are using it, old people are using it, adults in general are doing their jobs on this stuff. Everyone is communicating and talking to each other through social media, and there's no taboo. And it's generally not recognized that this is an addictive behavior that's happening. You know, you wouldn't just mindlessly do drugs without thinking of the consequences, but you might use Facebook without thinking twice because it seems harmless, it seems blasé, and everyone he knows on there.
Well, that's the thing. We're to the point now where they've done polls. The average American spends 24 hours a week online. And I don't think that counts people who work a job that's online also. I think the average person is spending at least one day out of every week fully 24 hours online. So that's how much it's being used. And 62% of people, at least in this study that they talked about at MIT Technology Review from January 2018, 62% say that the internet is important for maintaining social relationships. So they're not able to maintain their social relationships without it.
And it is a point in time where people need to hard break from some of these tools and the things that you rely on. We all have never taken a step back and actually asked ourselves, how should we be interacting with these things now, 7 years into it? I can't control that. I can control my decisions, which is I don't use this shit. I can control my kids' decisions, which is they're not allowed to use this shit. But everybody else has to soul search a little bit more about what you're willing to do, because your behaviors, you don't realize it, but you are being programmed.
So this has become enmeshed in society. You can't, I mean, if you want to be a functioning member of modern society in many ways, you have to use the internet. It's part of it. But what these people are saying when they speak of dopamine is essentially saying that your brain, through the use of algorithms on these platforms, the way they've been set up to take as much of your time as possible, to get as much data out of you as possible, and to keep you coming back for that dopamine hit, what they're basically saying is they have hijacked your brain. A former Google product manager came out and told 60 Minutes that some of the programmers in Silicon Valley actually call it brain hacking. And then he referred to his cell phone as a slot machine. And he says, every time I check my phone, I'm playing the slot machine to see what did I get? What likes did I get? What notifications did I get? He says this is one way to hijack people's minds and create and form a habit. So you make it so that someone's pulling a lever and sometimes they get an exciting reward.
The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behavior of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered.
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. A reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something, but you don't reinforce every time. You're perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that.
It's a design technique that's been embedded inside of all of these products, inside of all of this social media. In fact, it came out that Instagram was actually doing a thing where they would withhold likes from people so that they would receive a larger bunch of likes later on for a larger burst of dopamine. They'd have people get disappointed because they'd post a photo or something and they wouldn't have hardly any likes. And so the initial negative outcome of being disappointed of not getting likes would then be priming their brain for the large burst of dopamine they would get when a huge bunch of likes suddenly came through. They're basically using a variable reward schedule on people the way they would do to rats in a science lab.
One of the schedules which is very effective is what we call the variable ratio schedule, and that is at the heart of all gambling devices. People gamble because of the schedule of the reinforcement that follows, and this is true of all gambling systems. They all have variable ratios built into them.
B.F. Skinner did it, and we showed it in The Minds of Men. James Old's experiment. You know, he was electrically stimulating the reward center of the rat's brain.
In 1954, Olds created a reward map of the brain featuring locations where electrical stimulation caused mammals to come back for more. The reward map held true for rats, cats, monkeys, and humans. By 1961, James Olds made history after he implanted an electrode into the pleasure center of a lab rat's brain and conditioned it to trigger its own self-satisfying electrical stimulation.
This is a device which trains the animal to turn on the stimulus for himself.
And they showed that not only would the rat press the pedal over and over and over hundreds of times per minute, just like people do with their computer mice, but that rats in various experiments, they would starve and forego food. They would avoid sex in order to keep clicking on the button. They would even endure great pain. They would get shocks in order to keep pressing the lever.
I will electrify the grid. The animal must cross an area that gives a very painful shock to the feet in order to get to the pedal and stimulate the brain. This shows a rat is willing to pay a very high price in order to get to the pedal.
And they would do it until they died. So none of the other survival instincts overrode or kicked in. And that's how dangerous the dopamine-driven feedback loop is.
The problem is that behaviorist techniques are often invisible to the person who's being manipulated. And this has a long history. This has been done for a long time. It used to be that the only way to be subjected to continuous observation and modification was to either be in an experiment, or you could join a cult, or you could be in an abusive relationship. I mean, this has been done before, and often the people who are in these situations do not realize it's happening to them. In fact, the whole point is that it's sneaky.
And it's built into our communication. You're sitting there at the computer or standing around on your phone, and you're pushing buttons many times per minute over and over, and you're checking it. And when you have lull time, you're checking it again. And it's not only that behavior, but they're building in a system of social credit where your actual status in society, your worthiness to be lended money, your rating on Airbnb type of site or something is based on whether or not people approve of what you've done before. And it sort of follows you and tracks you and potentially haunts you.
It's a mechanical approach to manipulating people. And because it's so algorithmic, it doesn't involve direct communication, and people don't get the cues to understand what's happening with them.
I can control my kids' decisions, which is they're not allowed to use this shit. But everybody else has to soul search a little bit more about what you're willing to do, because your behaviors, you don't realize it, but you are being programmed. Even though we feigned this whole line of like, there probably aren't any really bad unintended consequences, I think in the back, deep recesses of our minds, we kind of knew something bad could happen.
And you've also got income tied to it. People are making their livelihood off of platforms, especially like YouTube. And then you've not only got social validation, dopamine-driven feedback loops telling people whether or not you liked it and what your self-worth is supposed to be, you know, emotionally speaking, but financially speaking. And you watch the numbers and it becomes a numbers game. And, you know, the whole idea is just messed up. You know,
yeah, even though the numbers many times over have been manipulated, and it's pretty obvious how easy it is to manipulate what numbers you do and don't get. I mean, we see this on YouTube all the time.
And they've been talking about how addictive it is. I mean, here's just a couple headlines. And yeah, headlines tend to be exaggerated, but when you read these articles, they're not exaggerating. They're literally talking about social media becomes the crack cocaine of communications. That's in the Chicago Tribune from 2 years ago. USA Today, why quitting tech and social media is harder than quitting cigarettes. That was from a couple months ago this year. Even High Times, which specializes in drug-related content, they wrote, is social media as addictive as cocaine? Swipe, scroll, swipe, scroll, swipe, and then rinse and repeat, right? I mean, this is very addictive behavior, and it's having a neural effect on people's brains, but the vast majority of people, they're not recognizing it. But again, in Silicon Valley, where the high-powered executives are meeting, they're taking notice. They're not using it. They're taking days off to avoid it. They're not letting their children use it. But everyone else, they're all about growing the numbers and keeping you engaged for longer and driving up the statistical number of hours per day that you're doing things.
How do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible?
The thing is, we've been living in a science experiment ever since they unleashed this technology on society. And they still don't know what the long-term effects are going to look like, even as they're upping us to 5G speed with zero latency, and they're deploying tens of thousands of satellites to go put a grid around the whole Earth so that the internet is everywhere. I mean, we're going to be completely saturated and surrounded by this. We still don't know what this is going to look like 50 years from now. But what they do know, and what studies are already starting to show, is links between smartphones and depression, social media and anxiety. People are having poor sleep quality. And the thing with the dopamine, and we've already seen this in the younger crowds, too much dopamine has been linked in scientific studies to risk-taking behaviors. And so that is why you see people on YouTube setting themselves on fire and eating Tide Pods. And there was even this one girl who, her channel got really big, and in order to keep the likes and clicks going, she was going to eat a live octopus on her YouTube channel, and it ended up attacking her face. But that's a level some people are at. We've also seen younger kids who've been driven to suicide based on cyberbullying. So these are things that are happening with this. And it's all part of this.
Because we get rewarded in these short-term signals, hearts, likes, thumbs up, and we conflate that with value, and we conflate it with truth. And instead, what it really is fake, brittle popularity. That's short-term, and that leaves you even more, and admit it, vacant and empty before you did it. Because then it forces you into this vicious cycle where you're like, what's the next thing I need to do now? Because I need it back. Think about that compounded by 2 billion people. And then think about how people react then to the perceptions of others. It's really bad. It's really, really bad.
But also there's another aspect here, and that is that the average addiction, whatever that is, alcohol, chocolate donuts, it's something you're probably going to be doing mostly by yourself, maybe socially. Maybe you're going to binge eat chocolate donuts. I don't know. But when it comes to these short-term dopamine-driven social validation feedback loops, it requires the feedback of the hive, Borg, of this internet, of this cybernetic collective of these various social media platforms. So it requires you to get that from everyone else to become part of that group flow in order to get that approval or get those likes or get those clicks or get those views or get whatever it is. So there's a difference between this and every other addiction pretty much that there is that I can think of, because this actually requires the mob herd mentality, the herd approval. And it was actually Chamath Palihapitiya, the former vice president of user growth at Facebook, who said that bad actors can now manipulate large swaths of people through these platforms.
Bad actors can now manipulate large swaths of people to do anything you want.
You're being subtly manipulated by algorithms that are watching everything you do constantly and then sending you changes in your media feed, in your diet, that are calculated to adjust you slightly to the liking of some unseen advertiser.
It is eroding the core foundations of how people behave by and between each other. And I don't have a good solution. My solution is I just don't use these tools anymore. I haven't for years. And it's weird. I guess I kind of just innately didn't want to get programmed. And so I just tuned it out. But I didn't confront it. And now to see what's happening, it really bums me out.
And so if you get off that, you can have a chance to experience a clearer view of yourself and your life.
But now you got to decide how much you're willing to give up, how much of your intellectual independence. And don't think, oh yeah, not me, I'm fucking genius, I'm at Stanford. You're probably the most likely to fucking fall for it. Because you were fucking checkboxing your whole goddamn life. No offense, guys.
And I think we're already seeing how that's working as far as trying to shut down people who don't have politically correct opinions or people who talk about controversial things on social media platforms and places like YouTube and stuff like that. I mean, a really good example of using this system in the opposite way would be all the stuff we saw with anti-vaxxers and the pressure that was put on people who came out and spoke out against vaccines earlier this past year.
And the reality is now I can take money and I can use that through all of these social media systems that exist to hundreds of millions of people, and I can convince all of Joe's friends and everybody like him of my opinion in very subtle and small ways. And he can do the same to me. We can do that about vaccines. We can do that about gay rights. We can do that about bathroom laws. We can do that about Roy Moore.
People were going insane, just throwing massive amounts of group hate from the herd, from the digitally steered hive at these people to try and get them to cave and change their opinions about this stuff, using that system against them in a negative way to try and reprogram their beliefs and thoughts and feelings on this. And that's one of the things that's been stated over and over by these people, including this guy who gave a 60 Minutes interview who was a former Google product manager. He said, this technology is shaping the thoughts and feelings and actions of billions of people. And that they're programming people. And there's always this narrative that technology is neutral, but that's not true because this technology has been programmed in a way to get this reaction out of people and to hook them.
When researchers try to determine whether positivity or negativity is more powerful, they're roughly at parity. They're both important. But the difference with social media is that the algorithms that are following you respond very quickly. They're looking for the quick responses. And the negative responses, like getting startled or scared or irritated or angry, tend to rise faster than the positive responses, like building trust or feeling good. Those things rise more slowly. So the algorithms naturally catch the negativity and amplify it and introduce negative people to each other and all of this. Catch the negativity and amplify it. It's the negativity that gets amplified. So you tend to have elections that are more driven by rancor and abuse, and you tend to have outcomes that are kind of crazy.
And once you have that going for billions of people, then you can steer and shape global opinion.
When it grows to 1 billion or 2 billion people, it literally changes your relationship with society.
Consumer internet businesses are about exploiting psychology. We want to psychologically figure out how to manipulate you as fast as possible and then give you back that dopamine hit.
I mean, we live in a world that's overstimulated. It's everything, anything, all the time, anytime you want. It's very possible that people a couple decades or 100 years ago had a deeper sense of purpose. And it's very possible that today people's sense of happiness and fulfillment is extremely shallow. It may be just a few clicks away from crumbling. And it's just ironic. Even the people talking about taking a dopamine fast out of Silicon Valley, they themselves are promoting it. One of the main guys who's pushing it is a venture capitalist investor, Dr. Cameron Sepah, and his article on it on LinkedIn starts, "Dopamine fasting 2.0 has gone viral worldwide." And he cites the number of views it has and the number of media outlets that are promoting it in all the countries. He actually talks about it in an interview and says, does he name it dopamine fasting just to appeal to the Silicon Valley mindset? Quote, "Yes, it helps me get clicks and makes it seem cool. My LinkedIn article on the topic has over 125,000 views. So if it helps more people to learn about it and practice it, I'm all for it." But at the end of the day, there is something very real to it. It's a stimulus control method. It's the input that affects the output. That's the way a feedback loop works. It's a cybernetic feedback loop. And that's the age that we live in.
We know for a fact that what all of these systems do, every single one, is it exploits our own natural tendencies in human beings to get and want feedback. And that feedback, chemically speaking, is the release of dopamine in your brain. And so what these feedback loops do, and they exist everywhere, in Call of Duty, in other video games, in social networking sites, they get you to react.
The algorithms that are following you respond very quickly. They're looking for the quick responses.
They get you to react.
And the negative responses tend to rise faster.
I mean, never before in history have so few people at just a small number of tech companies been able to shape how billions of people think and feel every day based on the information they're receiving through these screens. And so the bottom line really is we've got to start paying attention to ourselves, to our own burnout, to how these things are making us feel. And we've got to start unplugging and going outside. My dad used to say, I'm going to go stare at a tree for a while. Sometimes I have to do that because I recognize that I'm getting frustrated and I don't even know why. And I'm guessing it's because I've spent hours in front of a screen working. And it's just, we have to realize more than ever before, probably in the history of humankind, how important this is for our well-being, for our emotional and physical and psychological, mental well-being, to have a break.
I feel tremendous guilt. It literally is a point now where I think we have created tools that are ripping apart the social fabric of how society works. That is truly where we are.
The reality may be the entire business model of the internet may be fundamentally somewhat broken.
The business model is to addict you and then offer a channel to you to third parties to take advantage of that to change you in some way without you realizing it's happening. I mean, that's what it does.
And it is a point in time where people need to hard break from some of these tools and the things that you rely on.
Because I've noticed it, and I don't know if you guys have noticed it too, how just rushed and frustrated and irritated and anxious general society seems to be sometimes. You'll just be walking around a grocery store and you just kind of feel it in everybody. I think that's because everyone is getting so used to living more of their lives in this digital matrix that when they come back to actual reality and the thing doesn't match up because it's information overload in one place and everything's so slow in the other, it's actually causing people to have anxiety. I think it actually is causing people to get frustrated with actual reality.
Society has been gradually darkened by this scheme in which everyone is under surveillance all the time and everyone is under this mild version of behavior modification all the time. It's made people jittery and cranky. It's made teens especially depressed, which can be quite severe, but it's made our politics kind of unreal and strange, where we're not sure if elections are real anymore.
We're losing our humanity as we become more programmed into this technology.
Whether you're engaged in the internet and the technology or disengaged, do it consciously and do it with a purpose. And be aware of the potential ramifications and just know about it. There's lots of positives to the technology, but there's definitely some very tangible negatives. And these highfalutin executives in the Bay Area, they are taking time out no matter what it costs them or their company, and they're not letting their children around it.
When's the last time you heard of a 24-year-old use a phrase dopamine fast anyway? Like this, you know?
These are the times. These are the times.
I've been in a position where I was a part of a group that helped shape psychology of society. That's been a great experience, and I learned a lot. And so now in this position, what I say to myself is, what are the psychological things I'd love to change now? What are the psychological things I'd love to change now?